Well, thank you very much, Giorgio, and good morning, everybody. It really is a real pleasure and a privilege to have been invited here today to speak in this lovely and historic setting to honor Steve Gould's legacy to my field of anthropology. And I'd like to thank the organizers very warmly, of course, Professor Daniele particularly, and Dr. Pedrocco, who have made things so easy for us to come here. And I'd also like to apologize for not being able to speak to you all in your, or most of you anyway, in your own beautiful language, but I know we have great translation for those who need it. Now, I never knew Steve quite as well as some of the speakers at this meeting did, although I did know him for a very long time and I greatly valued our acquaintanceship. But by the time I arrived at the American Museum of Natural History in 1971 as a very junior curator, Steve was already comfortably ensconced at Harvard. So my first opportunity to meet him properly came only in 1974, when we were both invited to attend a meeting organized by the Wenner-Gren Foundation called Phylogeny of the Primates, an Interdisciplinary Approach. Now, of course, as none of you needs to be told, Steve was far from being a primate specialist. But even at this very early stage of his career, the reach of Steve's writings had already broadened far beyond the realms of invertebrate paleontology and evolutionary theory. And certainly they'd broadened far enough to mandate his inclusion in this very highly specialized conference. And specifically, his remit at the conference was to cover two things. One of these was evolutionary rates, but he actually rejected this assignment on the very unusual grounds for him that he'd already said all that he had to say on the subject. And the second assignment was to cover the roles of ontogeny and neoteny in human evolution, a subject on which, as Giorgio already mentioned, he'd published an important paper in Science with David Pilbeam in the same year. And this paper here really inaugurated an entire subfield of paleoanthropology that has flourished ever since. And of course, the canonical work in this field was Steve's first book, Ontogeny and Phylogeny, published soon after that. But what I personally found most interesting at the time was Steve's preprint for this conference. And this preprint contained a really virtuoso canter through the history of human evolutionary studies, which indicated that even at this early point, he knew an amazing amount about the history of ideas in paleoanthropology. It was a field he really cared about. Well, this meeting was held at Burg Wartenstein, the Wenner-Gren's historic conference center atop a mountain in Austria, where we were sort of incarcerated for a week with a dozen other colleagues and fortunately a well-stocked bar as well. But my interactions with Steve turned out to be less over the bar than over the ping pong table that they had there. And arguing with him there over the minutiae of paleoanthropology as the balls pinged and ponged and so on, I caught my first glimpse of the extraordinary inner energy that always carried Steve through all of his many and sundry undertakings. And this, in a roundabout way, brings me back to Steve's anthropological legacy. And in describing this particular legacy, it's really hard to know where to begin, because for one thing, the sheer quantity of Steve's output is daunting. And categorizing all these voluminous productions isn't easy either, as Michael Shermer found when in 2002 he attempted to quantify the variety of Steve's output in Skeptic magazine. Now, Shermer analyzed Steve's 22 books, let me get this right, 101 book reviews, 479 scientific papers, and 300 natural history essays in terms of their subjects and their themes. And he came up with two ways of quantifying Steve's extraordinary bibliography. His first approach was minimal. He placed the 479 technical papers that Steve published in a mere 5 broad categories. And here are those categories, and you can see that paleoanthropology, or even anthropology more broadly, was really not an important enough category to deserve mention. On the other hand, as you can see here, paleoanthropology was sufficient to earn a place in Schirmer's alternative maximal classification, which recognizes many more categories. But even here, only well under 3% of Steve's publications were actually classified as paleoanthropology. And this reflected the fact, also alluded to by Giorgio, that Steve rarely ventured into the formal anthropological literature. But what's also important is that pure quantitations of this kind are really inadequate to reflect what is truly important. And what is truly important is quite simply impact. And Steve's influence on anthropology, and on paleoanthropology in particular, was, I think, truly seminal. Now, in part, of course, this was due to Steve's many theoretically important contributions to general evolutionary biology. And foremost among these, of course, I have to differ from Dick Lewontin, was, of course, his collaboration with Niles Eldredge in spreading the notion of punctuated equilibria, a notion that enabled paleontologists, paleoanthropologists as well, to treat the famous gaps in the fossil record as actual information. Now, plenty of others at this meeting, including Niles himself, have spoken and are going to speak about punctuated equilibria, so there's really no need for me to say any more on this subject here, except perhaps to try to put the matter in anthropological perspective by noting that back in the 1970s, the early 70s, when Steve really got going, paleoanthropologists were in thrall to a particularly fundamentalist notion of phyletic gradualism. And it was Niles and Steve who gave paleoanthropologists the theoretical ammunition that they needed to allow them to make the first moves towards throwing off these intellectual shackles. And similarly, it was Steve who, in collaboration with Elisabeth Verber, insisted that exaptation was a sufficiently important factor in evolution to deserve a name that was untainted by orthogenetic associations. Exaptation is actually a key concept in paleoanthropology as much as it is elsewhere, and it's proven crucial, I think, to understanding human emergence. But in terms of specifics, I'm convinced that Steve's most seminal contribution to paleoanthropology was his insistence from very early on that human genealogy has always taken the form of a branching bush rather than a slender ladder. And let me give you a little bit of background here. During the 2 decades following 1950, paleoanthropology was dominated by what Steve called the hardened version of the evolutionary synthesis. And in the Anglophone world, at least, pre-war paleoanthropologists had been overwhelmingly anatomists by background, and they didn't have much interest or any interest in patterns of diversity in the wider living world, or indeed in evolutionary mechanism. So, having been trained largely in a theoretical vacuum, the post-war generation of paleoanthropologists was already primed to capitulate when Ernst Mayr came along and told them in 1950 to throw away nearly all the names that they had been using for fossil hominids. Here are just some of the names that were in common use at that time, and it implies, this quantity of names for a rather small quantity of fossils, implies an incredible amount of diversity in the record. But Mayr urged replacing almost every one of these names with a linear scheme whereby all of the fossil hominids known belong to a mere 3 species of the genus Homo in a single stately progression, as you can see here. Homo transvalensis, by which he meant the what we call the Australopiths today, to Homo erectus, to Homo sapiens. Now, elegant as it is, this, even in 1950, this view was not really supported by the material evidence available, and it should have been clear to everybody concerned that Mayer's brashly reductionist view of human phylogeny was at least incomplete, if not hugely incomplete. But while discoveries made soon after made most paleoanthropologists and even Meyer himself concede that the story was more complex, right up until the 1970s, the standard human phylogeny still continued to be represented basically as a single continuum, as you see in this, this phylogeny by Bernard Campbell, published in 1963. And Steve's eloquent voice was one of the first ones that was raised to make paleoanthropologists aware that there was an alternative. In 1976, as you can see, he stated boldly that ladders do not represent the path of evolution in paleoanthropology or anywhere else, and he rejected the simple ancestor-descendant sequence that Meyer had advocated. Now, I suspect that Steve rejected Australopithecus as ancestral to Homo as a matter of principle as much as anything else. But his immediate rationale was based on the recent discovery in Eastern Africa of specimens attributed to the species Homo habilis. And these alleged members, early members of our genus, were just as old as the South African Australopiths. And while it's easy, particularly in hindsight, to quibble about Steve's actual use of the paleontological evidence for sidelining Australopithecus, his argument for rejecting the ladder image, such as we saw in Bernard Campbell's phylogeny, was absolutely compelling. And specifically in the context of the hominid fossil record, Steve wrote that evolution usually proceeds by speciation, not by slow and steady transformation. And although none of this was news to anyone who'd read his 1972 paper co-authored with Niles Eldredge, it was entirely contrary to the received wisdom in paleoanthropology at the time. And if paleoanthropologists were by now beginning to lend Steve at least half an ear, it was principally because of his very highly effective use of metaphor. Now, perhaps the most powerful Gouldian metaphors were architectural, such as the well-known spandrels of San Marco, of which we've already heard much discussion at this meeting. But I think in paleoanthropology, his key metaphor was the one of bushes versus ladders. And this was an idea that really pushed paleoanthropologists to realize that diversity was a fact of human evolutionary life that needed to be embraced rather than to be denied. And continuing fossil discoveries have emphasized Steve's extraordinary prescience in this matter. Here's a series of human family trees that I've published at various times over the last 20 years or so. Take a look at them and you'll see what I mean. This is the situation as I saw it in 1993, and you can already see a dozen species and evidence for several coexisting species in the hominid family at any one time. This is 1998, and we're up to 16 species from only 11 or a dozen. Here's 2002. We're up to 20 species. Here's 2005, 24 species. And most recently, my trees from 2010 and 2011 with 25 species and counting in numerous coexisting lineages. And of course, this is exactly what Steve had predicted back in 1976. Here's what he said. We now know about 3 coexisting branches of the human bush, and I will be surprised if twice as many more are not discovered before the end of the century. And Steve's prophetic declarations were crucial in preparing paleoanthropologists for the notion, by now undeniable from the fossil evidence, that human evolution had not been linear, but had instead been a matter of multiple branchings on multiple occasions. But Steve's influence on paleoanthropology, and particularly on the paleoanthropological mindset, went well beyond this, largely due to his unceasing insistence that human beings are not and were not an exception to general evolutionary rules. So Steve's great gift to paleoanthropology was to hammer home the message with great eloquence and great force that human evolutionary history was just like the evolutionary histories of all other mammals, and that we should never treat human evolution as a special case of anything. But Steve had ideas on particular issues in human evolution as well, and he never shrank from using his natural history magazine bully pulpit to voice his opinions. Over the years, he issued a succession of shrewd and often influential judgments on subjects as diverse as the ones we see up here on this slide. But I think that without doubt, the greatest general furor that Steve created in paleoanthropology was actually caused by a mere detail, a detail of history. Namely, Steve's curious idea that the perpetrator of the Piltdown hoax had been the Jesuit priest and mystic and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard-Chardin, who you see here. Now, as you will all doubtless recall, for years following 1912, British paleoanthropologists were energetically promoting fossils collected at the site of Piltdown in southern England as fossils of the proto-human. And put together, the Piltdown fragments produced a skull that looked like this, basically a modern-looking cranium with a pretty large brain in association with a rather curiously ape-like jaw. Well, once this curious chimera had been revealed as a hoax in 1953, the search was on for the fraudster who'd perpetrated the hoax, and suspicion has at one time fallen on practically everyone conceivable. And 100 years after the fraud was committed, though, the perpetrator has yet to be identified definitively, although most people's favorite, or certainly for being involved, is a man called Charles Dawson, who you see on the left in this picture. But Steve's minority pick was poor old Teilhard-Chardin. And Steve first wrote about Piltdown in a natural history column that was published in 1979, and although at this point he presented the affair as an enduring mystery, Teilhard was at front and center in his list of suspects. Now, of course, this outraged a lot of Teilhard's admirers, of whom there were many, and Steve found himself obliged to vigorously defend this interpretation. And indeed, according to one of his editors, he ultimately wrote more words in natural history about Piltdown than about any other subject. Well, to cut a very long story short, Steve certainly managed to reopen the dossier on Piltdown, and a spirited debate has sporadically raged since on this matter. And his long dalliance with Piltdown gives us a dramatic manifestation of his fascination with history, in anthropology as much as in evolutionary science more generally. And Steve's devotion to the historically odd and curious, as well as with the mainstream development of scientific ideas, is, I think, well illustrated by his detailed account of the bizarre 19th century story of Saki Bartman. Now, Saki, dubbed the Hottentot Venus, was a San woman from South Africa's Cape Province who was widely exhibited in Europe before her death in 1915. And this satirical picture here came from Steve's personal collection. Now, Steve's publicizing of the extraordinary events that surrounded Saki's display may or may not have contributed to the eventual repatriation of, from Paris of her remains, where they now rest on a hilltop overlooking the valley in which she was born. But what is certain is that his interest in this sad case also reflected another of his long-term concerns, namely his concern with what he called scientific racism. And indeed, Steve's concern with the tragic history of Western racism was certainly the aspect of his interests that intersected most deeply with anthropology beyond simply strict human evolutionary studies. He even made the matter personal with a lucid and deeply thoughtful demolition in natural history of the purportedly scientific bases for discrimination against Jewish immigrants. And at a time when memories in the United States were still raw of the struggle for civil rights, Steve devoted a stream of natural history columns to this subject. In 1974, in his very first year of writing for natural history, he ruminated both on the race problem as a taxonomic issue and in its more political expression in its relationship to intelligence. And he also began his long-lasting and more specific campaign against genetic determinism. And he continued his exploration, and he continued his explorations of the roots of scientific racism in the work of 19th century embryologists such as Ernst Haeckel and Louis Bolk. But Steve's best publicized contribution to the race issue began in 1978 with his attack on the conclusions of the early 19th century physician and craniologist Samuel George Morton, who Steve characterized rather snarkily as a self-styled objective empiricist. Now, in his 1839, Morton, who you see on the left, in his 1839 work Crania Americana, Morton had presented the results of the most extensive study ever undertaken of human skulls, in which he concluded that the races had been separately created. And he listed measurements that showed, in keeping with prevailing beliefs at the time of racial superiority, that whites had larger brains than Native Americans, who in turn had bigger brains than Africans did. But after closely examining Morton's data, Steve brutally characterized his conclusions as a patchwork of assumption and finagling, controlled probably by his conventional a priori ranking, his folks on top. And he excoriated Morton for a whole long catalogue of sins such as those you see here, although in the end, to be fair, he found no indication of fraud or conscious manipulation in all of this. But he did see Morton's, but he did see Morton's saga as an egregious example of a common problem in scientific work, namely that scientists are often unconscious victims of their preconceptions, and the only palliations I, Steve, know of are vigilance and scrutiny. And he returned to his excoriations of Morton in his bulky volume, The Mismeasure of Man. And probably nothing that Steve ever wrote commanded wider attention than did this energetic critique of the statistical methods that had been used to substantiate one of his great bêtes noires, biological determinism. Namely, the belief that the social and economic differences between human groups, primarily races, classes and sexes, arise from inherited, inborn distinctions. And in Mismeasure, as in his science paper, he trumpeted his belief that statistical methods had routinely been abused in the service of cultural preconceptions. Now, he restated here his case against Morton at length, and he added a robust rebuttal of methods of psychological testing that aimed at quantifying intelligence as a unitary attribute. And one of his prime modern targets, of course, was inevitably Arthur Jensen, the psychologist whom he had already excoriated in the pages of natural history. Now, Jensen's admittedly egregious sin back in 1969 was to conclude that the Head Start programs that had been designed to improve the performance of poorly performing African American school children were doomed to fail, because the hereditary component of their performance was allegedly hugely dominant over the environmental one. Well, a predictable furor followed the publication of the Mismeasure of Man, paving the way for continuing controversy on the question of the roles of nature versus nurture in determining intelligence. And Steve was, of course, firmly on the side of nurture. And in this matter, he brooked absolutely no compromise, to the extent that he was really often deaf to nuance in this argument, which meant that he found himself frequently accused by Jensen and others of misrepresenting their ideas. Yet, even after Mismeasure appeared, the climax of the debate was still to come. The first edition of Mismeasure appeared in 1981, long before Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray published their notorious volume, The Bell Curve, in 1994. And at positively Gouldian length, Herrnstein and Murray trumpeted the argument that intelligence is largely inherited, and that innate intelligence is a better predictor of such things as income and job performance and chances of unwanted pregnancy and involvement in crime or than any socioeconomic or educational factors are. Further, they also asserted that a highly intelligent cognitive elite was becoming separated from the less intelligent underperforming classes. And they recommended policies such as the elimination of what they saw as welfare incentives for poor women to have children. And Steve, of course, was outraged by all of this. And hard upon the publication of the Bell Curve, he published a long article in the New Yorker magazine attacking the four unsubstantiated assertions on which he claimed the Herrnstein and Murray argument depended. In order to be true, Steve said, Herrnstein and Murray's claims required that these four things here that we see had to be true. And he showed convincingly that none of these assumptions was tenable. And what's more, 2 years later, in 1996, he returned to the fray with to the attack, really, with a revised and expanded version of Mismeasure that took direct aim at Herrnstein and Murray's long book. Now, within anthropology, of course, Steve's broader conclusions, as articulated in both of the editions of Mismeasure, were pretty congenial, and they found wide public acceptance as well. But doubts have nonetheless lingered about Steve's rather broad-brush approach to the issues involved, and particularly about a penchant he had to neglect any nuance there might have been in his opponent's positions, which led him, on occasion, we have to admit, to write rather Whiggish history. What's more, he was also prone to commit exactly the same kind of error in his enthusiasm of which he had accused Samuel Morton. And indeed, it turns out that he did this in the very case of Morton himself. In June of 2011, a group of physical anthropologists published a re-examination of Steve's attacks on Morton's craniology in Science in Science magazine and in the Mismeasure of Man. Now, as you'll recall, Steve had trashed Morton's posthumous reputation by suggesting that he had manipulated or had at least selected his primary data to fit his preconceptions about human variation. But by remeasuring the cranial capacity of about half of Morton's extensive sample of human skulls, of which you see one here, Jason Lewis and his colleagues discovered that the data reported by Morton had actually been quite accurate. They could find no basis in his actual specimens, as I say, one of which we see here, for Steve's allegations that Morton had unconsciously overmeasured European crania and undermeasured African or Native American crania, or that Morton had selectively reported his samples, or that he had used sexual size differences to skew his results, or had systematically repeated any erroneously reported means, all sins of which Steve had accused him. Now, these anthropologists did concede that Morton had attributed various psychological characteristics to different racial groups. But they pointed out that while Morton was inevitably a creature of his own times, he'd done absolutely nothing to hide his racial prejudices or his polygynist sympathies in his publication. And indeed, they showed pretty convincingly that by the standards of his time, Morton's presentation of his data had been pretty unbiased. And once more, while they were able to substantiate Steve's claim that Morton's final summary table of his results contained a long list of errors, Lewis and colleagues also noted that those errors would not have materially affected his conclusions. And in fact, to the contrary, they found that correcting those errors would actually have served to reinforce Morton's own declared biases. And to top this all off, they discovered that Steve had reported erroneous figures of his own. So all in all, Morton emerges from this whole history of reanalysis as more sinned against than sinning. And it seems that in this case at least, Steve had been prepared to allow his own unconscious biases to color his judgment of this early 19th century scientist. So Morton, naturally enough, had clearly carried all of the cultural baggage of his time and his ethnicity and his class. But so, it appears, did Steve as well. Oh, too bad I had a picture of Steve there, but never mind. But the big irony in this whole affair, of course, is that as I told the New York Times after Lewis and colleagues published their analysis, that in a bizarre way, Steve had proved his own point, namely that scientists are human beings and that when analyzing evidence, they always have to be on guard against the effects of their own personal beliefs and predilections. And it's almost inevitable that occasionally even the most rigorous guard is going to slip. Now, these slips will usually be in the details, as in the case of the errors of which Steve accused Morton. But Steve himself was not a detail man, as you all know, and he certainly wasn't a detail man in anthropology. His great strength always lay in the big picture, and at the point where science and society intersected, as they do regularly in anthropology, he was also a polemicist who saw matters of principle in black and white. So anyway, to summarize, while Steve's contribution to anthropology was unquestionably an enormous one, it was a largely indirect one. It didn't involve specialist matters, and neither did it need to. After all, Steve was a fossil snail expert and a macro theorist, not a working anthropologist. His influence in anthropology was consequently a subtle one that involved metaphor and mindset. And most importantly, I think, Steve's tireless propagation of the bushes versus ladders metaphor influenced the perspective of an entire generation of paleoanthropologists at the time, and is continuing to influence paleoanthropology today. And over the years, there's no doubt that he helped in a unique way to produce significant changes in the way that paleoanthropologists view the fossil record that they study. And likewise, with Steve's insistence on the equality of potential among the races of humankind. I am convinced that Steve's humane and passionate writing in defense of racial equality will be perceived in retrospect as a beacon of rational positivism in an age during which genetic reductionism was showing signs of resurgence, as indeed it still is, as race-stratified genome-wide association studies continue to dominate in the marketplace of human evolution, of human variation studies. And this, I think, points us toward the appropriate perspective in which we should view the Morton affair. Because, as Steve's longtime friend, the anthropologist Richard Milner, told a correspondent from Discover magazine, if Steve went off on a mistaken path, any question of deliberate fraud or hoax is absolutely out of the question. Whatever conclusions he reached on an issue, he did with complete conviction and integrity. Steve was a tireless combatant against racism in any form, and if he was guilty of the kind of unconscious bias in science that he warned against, at least his bias was on the side of the angels. And amen to that, and thank you for listening.